everyone, welcome back to Silver Griffin Makes a Thing, where we make whatever we feel like at the moment. I'm really excited about this project. In my last video, I mentioned that I'd been watching a lot of Delightful and the Doll Fairy videos, as well as a few other customizers. I've been thinking about trying my hand at this for about a year now, and well, I finally decided that now's the time. I'll go over the materials used as they come up, and a complete list will be in the description box below. The list is kind of long, so I'm not going to front load it this time. Since the local thrift shops are completely devoid of Monster High dolls at the moment, I hopped over to eBay and obtained this Ghoulia Yelps doll. I liked her sharper features, and I thought it would be easy enough to cover her gray skin later on. I made a little corset out of craft foam and a very basic pencil skirt to practice on before I started. I've only barely dabbled in sewing before this, so my skills in that area are really limited, to say the least. I tie her hair up with an elastic and use a pair of sharp thread scissors to chop it all off. I do my best to cut it as close to the scalp as I can. As an aside, guys, this is my very first custom doll, so maybe don't take this as a tutorial. I make quite a few mistakes in my process, and while I absolutely adore the result, there's a lot of things that I could have done better or a lot more efficiently. But hey, that's why there's always the next doll, right? I never played with Monster High dolls as a kid, because they were sort of after my time. I had Barbies. My favorite was this one really well articulated equestrian Barbie doll. I think her name was Stacy. She was the best because I could do all sorts of cool poses with her, and I like these older Monster High dolls for much the same reason. Before I start on any drastic changes, I make myself a quick reference pattern using pieces of plastic zippy bag and some painter's tape. We kinda didn't have any plastic wrap or masking tape on hand. It's okay though, this worked out pretty well. I wrap Ghoulia here up like a mummy, trace seam lines with a Sharpie, and then very, very carefully cut the whole mess off. I did this at the start because I'm not planning any body modifications that would change the proportions of her body, and I didn't want to risk scratching her once she was recolored. One of my college roommates was really big into cosplay, and she showed me how to make a perfectly proportioned mannequin using a t-shirt carefully duct taped to conform to your body. I know this probably isn't the most secret sewing life hack, but I'm not a sewer, so these are all new to me. I figured it would work well for my doll, and it did. Mostly, but we'll talk about that later. Masking tape and plastic wrap probably would have made this so much easier though. The plastic bag was thicker than plastic wrap, and it was really, really slippery. Not really fun to work with. And the painter's tape wasn't fond of sticking to it. But hey, it did what it needed to do. Some of the joints were so tricky I wasn't comfortable using my scissors, so out comes the X-Acto knife and a fresh blade. Always, always use a sharp blade when crafting or cooking. It's actually way safer than a dull blade. If it's sharp, you only need a little bit of pressure to cut through whatever you're working on, and it's less likely to skid off a tough or slippery surface and cut you. A pack of blades may cost a few bucks, but it's way cheaper than a trip to the emergency room for stitches. Be careful, use sharp blades, and if you're a youngin', either ask for help or have an adult supervising when using sharp tools and other dangerous crafting supplies. I often joke I shouldn't be left alone in bookstores, craft stores, or yarn shops without supervision, because I go just a little bit crazy with the purchases. But I'm quite confident in my ability to handle knives, so no adult supervision for me here. As I cut off the wrappings, I cut along where I want the seams of a finished garment to be, so I wind up with a front and back piece for the pants, a front torso, a back torso, 2 sleeves, and a collar. I label them and set them aside for later. Ooh, and here's the other reason I did this part first. Some of the Sharpie actually leaked through and stained her skin. If I had done this later, it would be a problem, but it's no big deal right now. Next, I remove the head by dunking it in boiling water until the vinyl is soft, then gently pulling it free. I've never done this on purpose before. I had a tendency to accidentally pop off my Barbie's heads and damage their necks, so this was really nerve-wracking for me. But I was successful, and the neck peg was only a little bit strained in the process. It's time to clean off her factory paint. Pure acetone, some Q-tips, and a bit of toilet paper gets that paint right off. Maybe one day I'll try my hand at doing that swipe off an entire eye in one go trick that I've seen. Today's not that day, but it may come. As an aside, guys, this is my very first custom doll, so maybe don't take this as a tutorial. I make quite a few mistakes in my process, and while I absolutely adore the result, there's a lot of things that I could have done better or a lot more efficiently. But hey, that's why there's always the next doll, right? Once her face is clean, I get a pair of old jewelry pliers and start scraping out those hair plugs. Guys, I was not expecting how gunky this was going to be. I don't know if the glue that they used had gotten soft over time, or if the dunk in boiling water had melted it, or if the glue that they use is just like that, but this was sticky and tacky and gross. I hated this part so much. I hate getting gunky, sticky things and residues on my skin. Like, I don't even like frosting holiday cookies or using oil-based clay. Just ew. Does anybody know a good solvent to get this kind of stuff off of skin? I tried soap and water and even a little bit of acetone, but it didn't really work too well. Maybe rubbing alcohol? I don't know. Chime in the comments below if you do know. As an aside, I did not film this process in the order that I've presented here. There were a lot of moving parts to this custom, and I had a 10-day dog sitting gig in the middle of it, so I was kind of limited in what I could do while I was gone. I've edited things into an order that seems relatively sensible for you to watch and follow along. Sorry for wandering out of the shot so much. I'm still learning my setup, and about halfway through this process, my new tripod arrived, so I'm going to be using that from now on. Right now in this shot, I'm using the legs from a portable display stand a friend made for me several years ago to display painted feathers on. I'm using it as a platform on which to set my camera. My new microphone arrived too. What do you guys think of the audio? We're not going to need Ghoulia's sculpted ears, so off they come. Out comes the X-Acto knife again and a very sharp blade. I use thin, careful strokes and gentle pressure to shave off the ears a little bit at a time, trying to get flush to the sides of the head. I'm trying to reduce the risk of damaging the head or my thumb as I do this. Because my blade is so sharp, it takes almost no effort to cut through the vinyl, and if I'd been using an old blade, I would have had to shove it through, and if that blade had slipped, well, that would have been a very painful experience I couldn't have shown on camera. Please learn how to properly handle a knife before using one. My mom's a great cook, and she taught me how to use knives starting when I was very, very young. So thanks, Mom, these knife skills have come in all kinds of handy. Now we get into what's going to make this doll really unique. We didn't need Ghoulia's ears because I'm going to turn her into a Twi'lek from Star Wars. This doll is going to be an original character, but you can see Twi'leks in the form of characters like Aayla Secura, Bib Fortuna, Darth Talon, and Hera Syndulla, among others. They're most known for their long head tails, which are called Leku. I've seen a couple other people taking stabs at making Twi'lek dolls before, including Anastasia Custom's amazing Darth Talon. Most people sculpt the Leku directly onto the head, but I'm going to try something a little bit different for my doll. I want to make interchangeable sets of Leku for different outfits, so I'm going to sculpt them onto wig caps and secure them with magnets. I'll go over the process here and in the part 2 video for this project, and I will probably also make a separate video detailing how I made them. What I'm doing here is figuring out the placement for my Leku. I'm using a kneaded eraser as a sort of temporary clay to get an idea of the proportions and then mark out where the Leku are going to go. I want them to be fairly high up and towards the back of the head, leaving room for a sagittal crest running along the back of the skull. Twi'leks can actually move their Leku and use them in a sort of sign language. Or at least they used to be able to. I don't know if that's still a thing, but I like it, so I'm going with it. The sagittal crest would provide an anchor point for the muscles that move the Leku, and I think it looks really cool. Placements made, I use my X-Acto knife to cut into the skull. There's a convenient circular plug here at the back of the head already, so we're just gonna cut out along that seam. Inside goes a pair of teeny tiny magnets that get secured with E6000 glue. I tried sticking them in there with a pair of bent nose pliers, but yeah, they have steel heads on them and that didn't work so great with the magnet. Whoops. I carry on anyway and get the magnets placed and glue the back of the head on. Magnet antenna. You know how I said I filmed this out of order? Yeah, this is actually the second set of leku I made. I made a wig cap out of muslin and a few coats of Mod Podge, then used more E6000 to secure on the matching magnets and some wire armature to build the leku on. I'll go over it more in the next video. These little magnets are doing a wonderful job of attaching the wig cap to the head. I'm very pleased with this. The cap just pops on and off like a dream, and there's no need to worry about this rough edge. Most female Twi'leks wear elaborate headdresses that wrap around the head and cover this area. This is a holdover from their first appearance in Star Wars back in Return of the Jedi, and is born of a very practical solution to a costuming problem. The headpiece concealed the transition between the actress's head and the prosthetic leku, as you can see here on Oola and Lin May. The one male Twi'lek we see in Return of the Jedi, Bib Fortuna, has a much more bulbous brow prosthetic, so I guess they decided he didn't need a headdress like the ladies did. Somewhere along the line, the whole headdress for female Twi'leks thing seems to become a staple, because the Twi'lek ladies in the CG cartoons like Clone Wars and Rebels still wear them. I bulk up the wire with some aluminum foil so I don't need to use so much clay. This trick is really handy if you're working with expensive clays or with epoxy sculpt, because foil is both lightweight and really cheap. With the foil in place, I start applying layers of Crayola Model Magic Air Dry Clay. I'm not a huge fan of this clay, but it is cheap and lightweight, and those are both pluses for me right now. It's a foamy sort of clay, and it has this sort of bouncy give to it, which makes sculpting smooth surfaces and fine details a challenge. I do use water to tame it a bit, and it mostly works, but I found out that it tended to crack as it dried if I did that, and it wound up needing patching. I did patch the cracks with more clay, and glue is needed, and that did seem to do the job. The first layer is mostly to cover up the foil and bulk up the leku. I wanted my doll to have nice thick leku, so they're a bit on the chunky side at the base and tapered to nice slim tips. On subsequent passes, I refine the shapes and do my best to smooth out the surface. Each layer needs to sit for at least 24 hours to be dry enough to work with, and then I left the leku to dry thoroughly for a few days before moving on to the next step. I went and rewatched some doll customizing videos in between filming and editing this, and only then did I discover that you can actually sand Model Magic clay when it's dry. That's something to keep in mind for next time, I guess. For now, I actually kind of like this textured surface I wound up with. Once the leku are thoroughly dry, I prime them with a layer of white gesso and get to painting. Twi'leks come in a wonderful wide array of colors, and I decided I want my girl to be blue. I start by painting the leku with 2 coats of a custom mixed light blue paint for full coverage. I'm jumping around in time again. I actually did this pretty late in the process after my new tripod arrived, so yay, new setup! Once the base color is dry, I go back in with darker and lighter paints to shade the leku. I've skewed my shadows to be slightly purplish and my highlights to be a little bit more green to give the paint job a bit more depth. Working quickly while the paint is wet and making minute adjustments to the color as I go, I managed to get a nice gradient. The ear cones also get primed and painted with a cool grayish brown, and then I shade them and set them aside. After painting the skin, I sketch in and carefully apply black paint for her tattoos. To make her tattoos even more striking, it's time for my favorite paint. Yep, it's the Golden Interference pigments again. After diluting the blue interference pigments with water, I carefully layer it on over the black to give it a shimmery, iridescent look. This doll is based off a character I'm going to use in a Star Wars Dungeons & Dragons campaign, which kind of totally took over my life for a while. She wound up with this kind of ice magic Elsa-ish vibe, so I drew inspiration for her tattoos from motifs on Elsa's outfits. Yes, I absolutely love Frozen, and Elsa is one of my favorite modern Disney characters. Fight me. Sometimes characters just take on a life of their own. I didn't have a set plan when I was building her for this game, and I wound up getting inspired by lore details and, of all things, the tech powers list. That's the equivalent of arcane magic for the Star Wars game setting, and there were some cool ice-themed ones that jumped out at me and just suddenly became the focus for her character build. She came to life by herself after that. With the painting done, it's time to make the headdress. The head's partially made up in these shots, so don't mind that. Using some silver ribbon I had left in my stash, I glue it in place around the front of the cap and around the base of the leku. The ribbon wasn't quite wide enough to do what I wanted, so I added a second wrapping and added some decorative stitching using cobalt blue embroidery thread. For embellishment, I glue on 2 tiny blue crystals and a piece of dichroic glass that was originally an earring before it fell off. The ear cones get glued into place while I pray they're placed evenly on the cap. And here's the first set of leku. This is going to be her everyday look, but I can pop these off at any time and change them out with a different set. I'm delighted with how they came out and with this technique. Jumping back in time, let's get to work on the body. I use my X-Acto knife to cut off a few remaining seams from the molding process, then use some fine grit sandpaper to rough up the plastic. I'm going to try and use pastels to change her skin from gray to blue. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work great. I don't have MSC. I live on a ground floor apartment with no place to spray it, and I don't have the kind of mask that would let me use it safely. So I'm going to try recoloring her with pastels and sealing it in with Liquitex matte varnish. It starts out okay, but the opacity just doesn't build like I want with subsequent layers. I don't know why. Maybe my pastels aren't pigmented enough, or maybe they just aren't clinging to the varnish, or maybe I just didn't give it enough layers. I was pretty impatient with the lack of progress, so I just sort of brute forced the whole process. What I wind up doing is mixing my scraped off pastel powder with water and varnish to make a sort of thin paint and building up color that way. It worked. I don't know why I didn't just switch over to acrylic paints instead. I guess I was just committed at that point and too stubborn to change things up completely. Oh well, she still came out nice. Dabbing on the varnish over the pastels gave her skin an interesting, almost sort of watercolor texture that I was reasonably pleased with. It was a challenge not to smear the shading entirely. I had to dab very gently and let her dry thoroughly in between coats. At some point I decided she was coming out the wrong color blue, so I went back and changed her to a slightly less cyan shade. Once I got her the color I wanted, I started blushing around the joints and form in a darker blue and highlighting her in lighter blues to give her more depths and a more lifelike appearance. I also give the hands a bit of blushing while I'm at it. I went back and watched Delightful's No MSC Face-Up video because I remember she was working with this same varnish in that video. Someone in the comments suggested using the matte medium instead of varnish to try and give the surface more tooth. That seems pretty reasonable to me, and it is a material I can use for painting projects if it doesn't quite work for doll customizing, so it's a win either way. I think I'll give it a try next time. I really wish I had just switched over to paints instead of fighting with these pastels so much. It took me days to get something that I was happy with because my materials just weren't cooperating. I think I had some idea that the pastels and varnish wouldn't chip off as much around the joints. Yeah, that didn't work out at all. The number of layers I needed built up and the joints just scraped the color off. I tried, it didn't work, I will try something else next time. I finally decided that this was good enough and stopped fiddling with it. It looks okay, and this doll is mostly for display anyway. It's fine. It's fine, Sylv. It's fine, really. With the body finally colored, I can apply her tattoos using black paint and interference pigments. You can see how the socket of the shoulder joint has actually already scraped off some of the color on the ball of the arm. Oh well. For a little added bling, I add another crystal to her belly button. No particular reason, I just thought it was pretty. Behind her on my desk, you can see a set of Leku with some great big cracks in them. I did manage to patch them up, but it was frustrating dealing with those. I go back and forth a few times trying to decide which color crystal to use. I love the iridescent ones, but her palette is entirely blue and purple, and the iridescent crystals just have too much pink and gold in them. Instead, I decided to go with the blue one that I would later match to the ones on her headdress. I attach it to her belly button with some more E6000. With the body done, it's time for some costuming. Disclaimer, I'm not a seamstress. I'm figuring out stuff as I go and I'm making half of it up. After some trial and error, I make these poofy belly dancer pants that I'm alright with her wearing as a temporary measure. The fabric is from a set of sheets I had that got torn. I like the drape and the color, and it was nice to be able to reuse it instead of throwing it out. The other part of her temporary costume is going to be a pretty, sparkly Elsa-inspired corset. I'd done a trial run at making a corset when I first got the doll, just playing around with the material. I'm using craft foam from Michaels, the kind that you can shape using heat. Using this test piece as a pattern, I trace and cut out a piece of foam to start working with. I alter the shape a little from my test to make it fit better. With my shape cut out, I carefully heat it over a candle flame to soften it and make it floppy, then press it against the doll's body to make it conform to the curves of her figure. It takes several passes to get it to take a shape I like. The foam gets really hot as it gets soft, so there's a narrow window of opportunity to shape it between too hot to touch and too cold to shape. Be super careful if you're going to use this method. I'm told a heat gun or a hairdryer work pretty well too, but at this point in time I'm dog sitting and I don't have all the tools I have at home. Fortunately, I have a fairly high tolerance for working with hot materials, and I do have some cold water on standby off screen, just in case. Once I have the foam shaped how I like it, I trim it down a little and mark where the holes for the laces are going to go. Time for some detail work. I use 3D fabric paint to reinforce the edges, make lines to mimic the boning of the corset, stop giggling, and make grommets for laces. I found with my practice corset, the tension on the laces actually made them tear through the foam, so I wanted to give these as much reinforcement as I could. The detail work gets 2 layers of fabric paint, letting it dry thoroughly in between. I also added some little blobs along the center front to mimic hooks on the front of the busk. I do like the black and gold look, but that's not at all this character's aesthetic, so it's time to prime. I'm using Liquitex gesso in white and using a couple of coats to make it mostly opaque. Now comes the fun part. Glitter. So much glitter. I found this pack of turquoise and aqua glitter at Michaels. I'm just going to use the finer turquoise glitter for this project, though I can't lie, I was seriously considering the bigger ones. But the turquoise is opaque, so that's what I went with. I coat the primed surface with Mod Podge, dab on glitter, let it dry, then repeat until the surface is absolutely covered in sparkly, glittery goodness. My room will never be the same. You know how it gets everywhere and lasts forever? I had a roommate in college once who was making sparkly ballet flats for a Tinkerbell cosplay, and a year and a half later we were still finding green glitter in the carpet. I seal in the glitter with a nice thick layer of Liquitex gloss varnish to make it shiny and to keep it from shedding sparkles everywhere. Afterwards, the detail work gets a coat of silver paint and some more varnish. I add embroidery floss laces and the corset is done. Just one last thing to go, the face-up. I'd been putting this off a little bit because the face-up is sort of the most important part of the doll, and I'd had trouble getting the body the right color, and I was nervous. But she needs a face, so I had to jump in. This time I just start off by painting her to match her body with thin layers of acrylic paint until the color is opaque. Already I'm a lot more comfortable using this method. I've been painting for years, and this actually isn't the first 3D thing I've ever painted. I like painting D&D miniatures. Fortunately, this doll is a lot bigger than a miniature, so I can get some actual detail on her. Once she's the right color, I start applying indigo pastels to blush the face, shading under the jaw, the back of the head, the temples, the eye sockets, under the nose and mouth, and the cheeks. I do my best to match the placement of the shading on the temples with that on the sides of the Leku cap, so the final result is more cohesive. Lighter pastels get applied at the forehead, cheeks, nose, and chin to start highlighting them, and then eventually I add a bit of fuchsia to the lips and cheeks before carefully dabbing on my matte varnish to seal it in. I tend to go back and forth a lot when it comes to this rendering phase of painting, pushing and pulling the darks and lights to get a good range of shades. It's actually really hard for me to step back and stop before I overwork the piece because I'm so finicky. I was really worried for the face-up, but it actually turned out to be my favorite part. This seems to be when the doll really comes alive and turns into a character. Before, it's just a jumble of parts. Now it's so much better. Here I'm trying to use watercolor pencils to start sketching in the eyes and other features, but they just weren't getting any purchase. I only barely got a few lines in to shape the eyes before I just gave up. It wasn't worth fighting with it when I know I can already do really good detail work in paint. Like before, I don't know if it was just that the varnish I was using wasn't giving the pencils any tooth, or if I was just not using good watercolor pencils. I did make a stab at wetting the pencils and drawing them on that way, and lifting the pigment off the pencils with a wet brush and painting them on, but I wasn't happy with those results. So straight to acrylics it is. I use my teeniest brushes to paint in her brows and the lines to shade and highlight the folds of her lids. I eventually go with the dark purple for her lashes, and I actually kind of regret it. They sort of fade into the shading around her eyes, I think. Maybe I just should have done them in black. Oh well, I was keeping myself to a super limited palette, and the purple doesn't look that bad, they just kind of disappear a bit. I decided to make this channel because I wanted to feel like I was doing something kind of productive while we're all still being asked to stay at home. I hate feeling idle and unproductive, and these videos have been keeping me pretty well occupied. Plus, they're a chance to help me expand my skill set, which is always a great thing. Things are pretty tough right now, and everyone's got a lot of stress to deal with. If you're dealing with it by just not putting any energy into being creative and learning new skills, that's okay. Sometimes you just can't make that kind of effort. A lot of people went into quarantine talking about how they suddenly had time to work on novels and other intensive projects, but the reality is, the stress we're all under makes it really hard to tackle these big creative projects. If you're feeling guilty because you're coping by just watching YouTube and playing video games and other activities just to pass the time, it's okay. Try not to feel bad because you're not doing and making things. Take care of yourself and your families while we all get through this. I paint her lips a soft mauve color and paint in purple irises, since that sticks with my palette and is actually an accepted color for Twi'leks. It takes a little tweaking and repainting to get her eyes looking the direction I want them to go in, but acrylic paints can hide a multitude of sins if you apply them right. When in doubt, just paint over your mistake and try again, especially if you haven't worked in a lot of shading yet. I add some shading and fine lines to give the irises some depth. Over it all goes more of my favorite interference pigments, in violet this time. I then paint in the pupils before detailing the lips. They get some shading where they meet, a bit of highlight to make them look nice and full, and just a touch of that slightly kind of stripy texture you see on real lips. Then I go back in with my paints and play around with pushing and pulling the shading around the mouth just a bit more, because I felt like the chin had gotten lost a little bit. I dot on some wet paint, then dab it off again with a cotton swab to make the effect more subtle, layering with this technique until I was happy with the result. Once that's done, I add white highlights to the eyes. I like doing a dot or oval for a main highlight and a little stripe near the bottom of the eye to make it look wet. You might be able to see in the background that I've got one of Delightful's videos going. Sorry Delightful, I thought I had that clear of my shot. Your videos are amazing! Some matte varnish over everything seals in the face up, and a little gloss varnish to the eyes and lips makes them nice and shiny. I only do one coat so they aren't too shiny, and I'm quite happy with the result. And the face up's done, and I love it. The pastels gave her skin an interesting, imperfect sort of texture that looks pretty convincing in person. And the glitter curse has struck already. At some point during the face up, she got one teeny little turquoise glitter stuck over her eyebrow and it got sealed in. So I guess she has like one single sparkly freckle. I'm not mad, I absolutely love it. I was really nervous about putting her head back on. Instead of using hot water, which I was scared would damage the face up, I used a hairdryer to heat and soften the vinyl around the neck hole. It worked great, actually, and with absolutely zero damage to the face up. I'm pleased with the color matching between her head and body, and while I probably could have taken the time to cover up all those little hair plug holes with clay or something, I decided not to. She's gonna have a Letku cap anyway, so it'll be covered that way. Speaking of her Letku, let's put those on. We have our lovely little Letku cap here, complete with headdress. There we go, one beautiful Twi'lek. I'm naming her Lyn, which means snow in the Twi'lek language. Fitting for a character who's going to have ice powers, isn't it? I was a little concerned that the curve of her Letku might interfere with her posing, and it does, just a bit. It's not too bad though, and the Letku cap isn't so heavy that it just yanks her head out of her pose. It just makes her a bit top heavy. That's okay, I love the result, and I love how this first doll custom has turned out. But that's not all I have in store for this doll. I mentioned that this costume was just sort of a placeholder and was the reason I wanted to make interchangeable Letku caps. In my next video, I'll be starting on what I had in mind for a costume since this one has gotten really long. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It's amazing how a little paint and some basic craft supplies can turn a mass-produced doll into something so unique and beautiful. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss anything. There's more in store for Lyn here, so join me next time on Silver Griffin Makes a Thing. I know what I'm making next, but after that, who knows?